So this is Newsprint. It's non-archival, which means it's going to break, crack, yellow, fade over a short amount of time. But it is good for volume, like drawing a lot for your practice, and it's cheap. There's a joke that some of your best drawings actually happened on newsprint because there's no pressure, right? So you can always treat it with fixative if you want to try to preserve it a little bit more. You can see there's a smooth glide to the application, and the broad strokes are easy, and they pick up the grain of paper just a little bit. On newsprint, the fibers don't really visually interfere with the material, and so the charcoal can really shine as itself without that textural interference. Despite how it doesn't last in terms of over time, it is very tough paper, and so you're going to have a lot of fun experimenting on this with different kinds of pressures that you can use, and especially in terms of practicing your blending, it really seeps into the paper very well and gives you a good idea of how a real finished, polished work of art can look like and the tones that it can take on. So this is a type of panel called Masonite. They're really cheap and really excellent surface to practice on. It can be gessoed or sanded in preparation of also taking the materials as well. But in its untreated state, it's very smooth and solid. It has the feeling of newsprint, except it's much more durable and sturdy and can make working on your lap, for instance, let's say if you don't have a board, really easy to do, or you can mount it on your easel and you won't have to have an extra backing to help you out. Along with being durable, it really takes the value range really well. Using broader strokes, however, the natural grain of the Masonite is going to show. Do you see those horizontal lines in the middle of the strokes? And that's a given for any kind of wood-based panel that you're going to be using. But how it differs in wood paneling, the Masonite versus like a pine board, is that Masonite is basically pressure cooked wood fibers, so it's really highly compressed, which is going to give you the opportunity to do the really highly polished blending that you see here. And you can create really fine polished artworks just on this surface and then treat it with a fixative followed by a varnish, with no previous surface treatment required. One of my favorite surfaces to work on in any media is actually canvas paper. It is woven very finely of fiber, and it acts like any other kind of linen or gessoed canvas that you might pick up from the art store. Because it is woven fabric, it has those microscopic pits to it, which is why the texture is showing up so much more. It's like the charcoal is just grazing the surface really, and you'll really have to put a lot of pressure, or later we're going to see heavy blending to make sure that the material is ground into the entire surface. Despite a layer of charcoal kind of resting on the surface of the canvas, it actually seeps in really well, which means that trying to erase it by a regular means through like a rubber eraser is much more difficult. So when the pressure is added to the stroke, the charcoal kind of breaks off a lot to the canvas. The grain sort of acts like a sandpaper in a way, but despite that, it's still really supportive of charcoal's natural range of value, and depending how you scatter it is going to give you a lot of interesting textural effects. Depending on the handling of it, the charcoal actually can be worked into the sunken texture of the canvas weave, leaving uniform areas of tone. The top one is cold press, and the bottom one is hot press. And I have them against each other so that you can see the direct difference when I apply the charcoal. Since we're not dealing with the water component right now, this is mostly just a texturally based decision that you would make in picking your paper. You can really start to see the difference when your strokes have more heft to them, as with using the pencil. Although both can support messier or looser line work, the hot press is what gives you the room for the delicacy, detail, and precision. So here, when I use the edge of the Conte to be able to spread more charcoal in larger sections over a shorter amount of time, you can see how the hot press still has its own innate pattern in the paper weave. And these impressions are really cool to start to bring out of the paper depending on how you use the charcoal. And they can really lend to whatever atmosphere you're trying to develop. If getting a very refined product is important to you, then cold press may not be the paper for you. Hot press really lends to those layers that you can get in terms of blending with your stomp or your finger or whichever else you may choose. The delicacy can be retained, whereas in the cold press, the texture is just too overwhelming for the charcoal to fight with it to get that same kind of detail. But in the end, it's going to depend on how you handle it. Here, for example, I can get very similar textures and outcomes from using the stomp in a single straight line, and it's almost indecipherable which one is the hot press versus cold. All right, so here we are with our general materials. And we're going to go through a demonstration of the properties of everything you see here. They each have their own interesting individual properties that they bring to the table in terms of understanding how to work with charcoal. It's really awesome to have an understanding of all of them because really they come from the same place. So for this demonstration, I'm going to be using one type of paper only so that you can see the properties of all the charcoal in contrast to only one surface. But just for the sake of simplicity, we're gonna keep with Newsprint. Okay, so really the principles of using the charcoal pencil are the same as using any kind of pencil. We have hatching, liner contour, and shade. So direct lines like this, and you can build them on top of one another. You can vary your pressure, but again, with the harder pencils, especially if you're using a cheaper paper, it may even take off part of the paper. The cross hatching, you can build up textures like this. Again, like let's say I'm going to hatch on a 6B. You already get a sense of depth that is not occurring over here, just due to the nature of the 6B charcoal. Line and contour is going to be the same kind of thing. It has to do with your line weight and your pressure of how you press into the paper as you go along. Let off the gas, push again, come back around, press in further. This is how you vary your line weight. It's really easy to control, especially when you're using in pencil form. It's not going to get away from you too much. Let's see what happens with HB. You can tell it's acting much more like a graphite pencil than charcoal. This would be good for initial sketches or layouts. Lastly, let's see just a square. We're going to go to corner for a gradation, starting with the heaviest. Pressure. Again, and it's taking some of the paper with it because of how hard the pencil is against the cheaper paper. Working with the pressure, I'm going to try and go as deep as I can because this pencil is so much smoother. Like technically, my pencil can move more freely. Let's go again. That if we're going to extend this, the more delicate you use it, the more of the paper grain is going to be revealed to you. So it's just scraping the surface, and the HB does not have that quality. It's much more of a hard graphite look. So the next material is beloved by all students of life drawing, and that's Conte. This is a staple to have in your art toolbox for sure. It's pretty solid unless you purposefully break it in half, or you again put too much pressure on a certain angle and it'll pop. Or the common thing in life drawing sessions is to find this crushed all over the floor because people drop it and step on it. But other than that, it's pretty sturdy. Now in this selection, it comes in a wide array of colors, but in this it's just an assortment. We have the traditional black, we have the white highlight, we have a really nice brown, and then we have sanguine. So if you look back into the Western historical canon of traditional art masters, you're going to see a lot of drawings with this type of tone. But for the sake of this, you don't have to get this. They sell these as singles in any kind of art store, so it's mostly in terms of preference. Now, Conte is really one of my favorites because of how sturdy it is and how varied your line work and strokes can get. You can start to shave off some of the corners and work it in if this is helpful for you. Unless I want to do really faded line work, I really don't hold it like that myself personally. Again, it's just a stylistic choice. Often I hold it kind of almost like a pencil, the way that I hold a pencil, but so that my top finger is kind of guiding the tip to where I want it. But the thing about this is that sometimes it's really cool to actually break it and then have it a little bit shorter so you can really get a good feel for how versatile this material can be depending on how you actually physically handle the Conte. So when it's short in my hands like this, I feel like I have a lot more control and I can, without drawing anything in particular, you're going to get really interesting shapes by curving and moving and drawing mostly on the edge of the Conte. Start with a large swath on the side and then cut across, turning the charcoal with it, turning again. You can get a lot of really cool, interesting variations. Coming back to the tip like this and coming down here. Another thing that I often do is I shave down my Conte, defining it to a point, which is going to give me a tool that has both a finer point for the detail, and then I can use the other end for my more large shapes. You can really go as fine as you want with this in shaping it, and now it becomes more of the texture of the charcoal pencil. So the other thing I want to introduce you to is the stomp. It's acting like a blender or a ghost stroke, which is really cool and can give you a lot of interesting effects. So you can use the stomp to directly apply the dust, and you can work it out from the center like this, using either the whole width of the tip or making little points like that. Or sometimes we will already have something sort of roughed in right here. And if we just want to make it a little bit more delicate, we can come in and start from the deepest places and really start to smooth it out, giving a completely different effect to the object that we've just sketched out. And maybe you went a little bit too far and it looks over blended, and you can go into your powder and reapply in spots that need a deepening, or again, you can come back and reapply layer on layer with the Conte again, and then go back in if you want to completely reblend. And going back and forth like this is how you develop really nice depth in your work, in whatever forms that you're working on. Willow charcoal is one of the primary medias when working from life, especially. You'll see this in a lot of artists' toolbox when we're doing life drawing from the figure or still life. You use it with a gentle touch because it is extremely fragile and guaranteed it's going to break no matter what you do. But generally, when I use it, I keep a very light touch, and I do tend to grip it further from the point at which it's going to be touching the paper for like really soft marks and general shape making. This is really great. It gives some really nice variation of value as well. You just can't press too hard or it's gonna do that. Okay, so let's pretend I'm in a life drawing class and we have only a few seconds to get our gestures on the page. This is a really great warm-up tool for doing short sketches. And you can still get some really nice line variation going on. But again, careful. Undoubtedly, it's going to break. You can also use the edge of it to fill in. And it's not going to be perfect or even, but sometimes that's what's going to give it an interesting quality to it as well. Not all the drawings have to be immediate and quick, but they're definitely excellent for life drawing sessions, or if you have a still life that you want to keep practicing, maybe in different styles or line qualities. And it's okay if you like run it around your paper and everything when you're working with this charcoal. All right, so this is regular Willow charcoal. It actually comes in a much more bigger variety than just these three in terms of width and thickness. And it can be really helpful depending on how large you work. Now, me personally, I like to wear off the edges. If you can see, there's a pretty sharp edge right there. And I like to wear it down a little. So I usually do that by drawing just off to the side or on a scrap piece of paper. I like work it in a little bit, get it ready, and then I can sort of flatten one side if I want to and get prepared for the different kinds of textural strokes I can make. Or if you'd rather, you can sharpen it or shave it down on some sandpaper, especially if you want to use this more like a pencil, for example. Adjusting the tip of the charcoal is going to be key in developing different kinds of line widths off the bat. So already you can see that there's a whittling down of the tip there, which can give a lot of interesting formations on the page. If you don't want to waste all this charcoal on the sandpaper, your other option, make sure it goes into some kind of container or another piece of paper that you can carry it to, and you can start to chisel. Again, when you do this, you need to be wearing a mask because you can see all that fine particulate matter is going into the air. And no matter, even if you think that this is going to be, oh, I'm just going to sharpen it for a little bit, it's not going to be so bad. Trust me, if you work without a mask, you're going to feel it in your lungs and you're going to be sneezing charcoal for a few days after. And now we have a more sturdy, full charcoal pencil-like that we can really do larger swaths of value fill in than as opposed to the fine line work that the vine charcoal has. Also, for the thicker guys, for this, really good to break apart, especially if you're working larger. And again, there's sort of a type of coating, you can sort of see it. You really need to either work on here or open the charcoal up a bit. I'll show you in a second what it looks like. If you just open up the surface, you can definitely tell there's definitely more charcoal that's exposed that will give you a richer tone right away. There you go. These sizes are really good when you're working large with all kinds of different kinds of paper or doing background work. Willow is still very delicate by nature. It is not going to give you very deep set blacks, but we're going to explore that in a second. Now here we have, right here, the regular powder, and here are the shavings that we did with the Olfa knife. You can see that this is much more chunky, and this is ground to a fine powder. This is fine on its own, but if you have any kind of hard surface, even a rolling pin or a flatter stone, this is from my printmaking supplies. It's called a baron, and you can work to grind this down into a powder. That's a little bit finer. Kind of depends on what your style is, but you can either put it on your drawing if you're a little more rough with your drawings, or you can put it off to the side on a different piece of paper. I recommend always using gloves. Mine are textured, so it's going to give a bit of texture to it. That still has a lot of bits in it, so it'll have those striations, which actually makes a pretty cool effect. I would just refrain from unnecessarily swiping it anywhere or doing any kind of frantic motions that, if you want to keep your space more neat and tidy, just make sure that your container has a lid that can keep all of this in a safe place that's not going to make a huge mess. But you'd be able to tell definitely texturally how much softer the artist charcoal is versus the stuff that you shaved off from your other charcoal bits. But really, they are going to work the same. What's cool about the powders is that they can also be mixed into all sorts of things for mixed media. It can go into other paints, it can go into other gel mediums. You can mix it with water or any other kind of binder, and it's going to give you something interesting from that result. So the next thing I want to talk about are resists. There is the green painter's tape, but I find that it doesn't create a lot of sharp defined edges when I remove it, so I really prefer the blue painter's tape instead. But it's up to you. I'm just doing a test. Usually the green tends to bleed under here, but I often use canvas, so that makes sense since there are going to be some spaces in the fibers. But just for good measure, we'll do a test of both. Something fun. Let's try to line that up. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we just make sure that this is flush. And let's give it a go. This is on hot press watercolor paper, and I'm going to be doing the wet onto dry method that we just saw. Now, since it's a different surface, it's definitely going to take it a little bit differently. You'll notice that the initial strokes don't actually disappear like on the canvas. It was much more easy to blend them in together. So if you're going to do this type of stuff on paper, there's a little bit more calculation that's needed before you begin. The reason the marks are staying put on the paper is because of the paper's own absorbency. We don't have any kind of surface treatment that creates a barrier for the movability of the water and the charcoal like the canvas does. Although you can drag the charcoal around somewhat, The points of contact with the pencil or the charcoal, whichever you're using, may remain. You'll also be able to feel the paper lifting, so it's very important to appreciate the limits of whatever surface that you're using. But you see that the paper can really take a lot of interesting values and tones. This is already seeping in and saturating and drying, whereas with the canvas it took far longer for it to dry. Now let's see how the resists did. We'll start with this corner. See how it did. Pretty clean. I tend to have trouble when I use it on canvas because of the way the fibers are woven, but see here? The issue with this, sometimes this can happen because this was overlapping and it wasn't completely flush, and the adhesion from the green tape was not fully down on the paper, so that's why the little leak happened. But sometimes accidents or mistakes like that, they work. Super bright and clean. See, even I automatically saw a fence here and there's a shadow being cast, so you never know what kind of mistakes can lead to invention. Okay, now the blue tape. Oh, really excellent. Look at that peel. Fantastic. So tape resist is absolutely excellent. If you have the patience, you can even do a kind of paper cutting into the tape, and you can go as detailed as you want and start to get really nice, interesting kind of stencil-like qualities. So really the sky's the limit with your imagination in this type of resist. So the first thing we're doing is going to be water-based. The spray bottle. So I'm going to take Willow, and I'm working on canvas here, and right from above, you can see how much that sprayed it out. And what you can do is take something absorbent, a cloth, a napkin, paper towel, and I can start to lift to make the watered aspects bleed a little bit into the canvas. Let's try another section. Now, let's say we're going to work in the charcoal into the canvas for this part. We can even take our finger and move it around so it's really ground in to all the fiber weave. And again, using the spray bottle, cover that up so it doesn't get. And you can see the charcoal is getting pushed by the water into deeper parts. Use something absorbent, even a stomp, and you can remove the watered down parts. Just like we did with the eraser, except now we're working with wet media. The other cool thing that you can do is if you wanted to plant textures, if you're working with a textured paper, since this is already wet down, let's say we're working on another piece of paper, go here, briefly burnish it with your finger. You can already see it soaking through, get that impression. So if you're working like with mixed media or abstract and you want to really build layers and layers and layers, this is a really fun thing to play around with. The next one, we're going to use a simple acrylic brush for the detailed and refined work. And you set it up like any other kind of painting. Let's say you do an underdrawing to secure the placement of your images. A water and a brush is all that's needed to turn the dry media into wet. So even though the charcoal is not uniform as you draw it on the canvas because of the texture, once you add the water, you can see it turns into something similar to watercolor. You can drag the charcoal around, adding water to the edges to let it flow into what's already there, and let the water do its work in moving the charcoal around. So once it's all wet in, you can keep adding water to encourage those kinds of blooms that you see in watercolor, as the ground will keep expanding outward with the addition of liquid. And by ground, I mean the initial charcoal sketching that you did. Because the more water you add to the center of the mix, it pushes the pigment or the charcoal dust out from that space, which is then how you can take a napkin and lift that water, and in its place remains a pattern. You can also put dry into wet, so here I'm reworking the pencil into the already watered down charcoal. It's kind of like watercolor pencil as well, and will have a similar effect in the outcome if you've ever used that media. And I just let it sit and it kind of disperses on its own. It's really good for detailed work, like on an underpainting or an underdrawing, like I mentioned before. The charcoal will actually blend into the first layers of the paint, giving a darker undertone to work from. It's really fun to go back and forth between the dry and the wet, seeing what kind of interesting effects you can create as the edges of both of them can meet and present really interesting shapes and natural forms like this bloom. So here I've laid down some water as a wash first. And as I delicately go with the willow, you can see it's sort of expanding out by the nature of how the water's taking it. But then when I do a larger swath and really start to get it worked in, it dramatically changes. This is my favorite 6B pencil, and you can already see the value difference between the Willow and the 6B. 6B having a much darker value range. This is really excellent technique to get very light washes, even if you're using a charcoal that has denser value properties. These lighter washes will also dry even lighter than what they look like when they're wet. So it's really nice to use if you don't want to use the absolute blank lightning white of the canvas that you're using. So now I'm going to work on having a gradational wash. So I put that deep 6B at the top, and I'm just dragging down with some additional water in my brush to make the charcoal disperse more evenly. And a lot of it is not even in my control. I just move it around a bit and the water will take it to where it's going to go. I am lifting the charcoal breakoffs that I can see, but you can definitely keep them in for some kind of textural effect. I sped this section up so you can see how the water behaves over time, affecting the charcoal. You can control it to an extent, but it's kind of cool to wait and see what occurs naturally. So the hot pressed paper is on the left and the cold pressed paper is on the right. And since hot press is smoother, I went with a contour drawing at first to catch the whole form. Whereas with the cold press, you can see that I took a more sketch-like approach, accounting for how the pencil jumps along the textured paper. My marks kind of echo that. And because of that, the proportions are completely different between the two pictures. So on the hot press, I managed to get the entire plant situation within the borders of the paper, and you can see that I had over-enlarged what I was seeing with the leaves and left little room for the planter that was holding them. I took a lot more time on my line work on the hot press as well, and I turned to blending on the cold press much faster because to fill it out is a larger process when dealing with the texture of the paper. I was also more heavy-handed on the cold press, driving the charcoal into the texture, and that pressure changes the tone of the drawing because it gives you much more higher levels of contrast. In my opinion, there's a much more meditative blending process on the hot press, and I treat the leaves much more individually with the mid-range tones than with the cold press. You'll see on the textured paper, I gravitate towards pushing detail quicker so that the work was more centered on the patterns that is reflected in the paper. Despite using the same tool for each drawing, you can see how different the outcomes are in how you handle it. The charcoal travels really well on the hot press, but is caught in the grooves of the paper on the cold press, and this roughness gives the drawing on the right a little more of a harder edge to it visually than the one on the left. Because I didn't keep the images at the same proportion, this zoomed in picture of the leaves gave me an opportunity to invest in my miscalculation and to go more detailed than the one on the left. So on the left, I'm working in Vine, and on the right, I'm working in Conte. I'm doing them in tandem so that you can really start to see the differences between the two materials and how I handle them. So with the Vine, I'm starting with line work. And with the Conte, I begin to model the general points from both outside and inside of what I'm drawing, using the full media at the tip and the side. I'm really making sure that I cross-check my proportions and then put little notches with a Conte as to where the major points are that I can end up reconnecting all those dots, for lack of a better term. I work a little bit more loosely with the Vine. I don't mind going over and over my old lines. Or making suggestions that are not particularly realistic. They might be bumpy, out of shape, and not as angular as how I use the Conte. I feel that it lends to a much more flowing way of seeing your object or whatever you're trying to end up capturing. So I base my decisions heavily upon line work or contour and a little bit of hatching for the shade. That said, I still do take this method somewhat with the Conte. However, I vary my mark making by twisting and turning the charcoal to get those broad strokes that represent the leaves, rather than relying on strictly contour to develop the forms. I'm now going to speed up the drawing process so that you can see how it looks when the time is compressed and the different kinds of development that happens. You'll notice that I'm much more heavy-handed with the shadows using the Conte, and that's just because I feel that it's a very emotional medium that really lends well to high drama, which using a lot of contrast can sort of instigate in your drawing. Now the vine drawing has far less contrast in general. And because of the nature of the charcoal, it really doesn't have the same intensity as Conte, but you can still get some medium to deep values depending how many times that you run the charcoal over the same spot, your pressure. It also matters how you work with your lines. So you can do hatching, so crisscrossing lines over the other to build up the feeling of deeper tones is something that's available to you across media, but even in Vine. You'll notice that I took to starting to work in the leaf detail much earlier than I did with the Conte. Vine is really great for the sort of quick gestural squiggly stuff, and I thought it was perfectly suited for something like the details of the snake plant. So here, coming up with the Conte, you're going to see how I change the direction of how right there. You see how I sort of changed the angle of the Conte as I was drawing with it, and then move it towards the tip and then come all the way down for that thinner line work. This is how you learn to vary your line width and how you can get the impression of overlapping structures towards one another. The end stages of both drawings are similar. I pick main points to emphasize, and with Vine I chose to focus on the leaf pattern, and in the Conte I focused more on layering with value ranges to imply that overlapping of the snake leaves to one another. As I mentioned before in the properties, I find that Vine charcoal lends to quicker drawings, one that have more agility and a fast-paced feeling to them. And Conte really allows me to go into the more depths of the details that can be in front of me in my still life, and really applying those interesting shadows that I see on the form. For this drawing, I'm going to be using both Conte and the charcoal pencil, and it's going to be on toned paper. Working on toned paper is great for already having a mid-range values established, so you can practice drawing in different concepts, which I'm going to be doing as I work with this image. I'm starting with a contour line drawing right at the top, because right now it looks like I'm drawing the plant, but I'm actually tracing with my eyes and then down to my pencil the positive and negative space that's given to me between the plant and the wall. This type of thinking can really help you source and define the shapes that you're looking to capture. And the more that you practice shifting your mindset between what you see versus the background is going to help define what you see, and your awareness of shape and form will develop quickly. It's the most fun, so I ended up dropping a huge portion of the white in immediately just to give it a solid base to build some of my shapes from. As you can see, I am using contour drawing, but since this side is where the light is hitting, I take some points of it brighter in the Conte and clean up the edges in pencil. And of course, the highlights are the most fun part to address, so I'm doing them first. Usually I don't do detail first, but in a case where I'm kind of working in an inverted manner where the strongest points of the light source are really, really bold, it actually helps me map out and guide my drawing for myself. By doing this, it can lock you up into its measurements, which can lead to things that are out of proportion. But I find inverted drawing has a little more room for error and suggestion rather than a full valued polished piece. When drawing the shadowed aspect, I keep my touch light so that the line value doesn't actually match where the direct light source is on the other side. I have a much more calculated and patient approach in terms of dealing with shadows that are on toned paper, and I prefer to build them up very slowly rather than make a educated guess on what the right mid-tone may be. This is why I borrow the chalk or the charcoal from the other side of the paper to lay in something that's just a little bit brighter than the toned paper, but not enough to really make it overwhelm the opposite side. But I start to place the really bright highlights where it's going to make the entire image pop out a little bit more and give a lot more volume to its shape. In inverted drawings, I tend to work from the outside in, addressing both the left and right before coming into the middle to pick my focal points. With this work, I really chose the less is more approach here and decided that the places that had the most light focus is where I would pick out the details. In reality, the wall value behind the plant is much more mid-range, but I choose to enhance it for dramatic effect with the layers of Conte. There's a lot to be said in your drawings for accuracy and representation, but at the same time, even still lifes or life drawing sessions, there should be some room for you to put your spin on it or to bring your imagination into the picture. It's definitely up to you what you want to amplify and what you want to tone down. These are all considerations when I go to do a drawing, no matter what media I'm working in. First, I'm going to build the background with Conte. You see it still has its own patterns on how you lay it down on the page. This is still just on newsprint again. And depending on how you turn the Conte is going to determine how the pattern is going to sit. But you can keep building on the layers and layers to build it up. So you can take anything soft and smooth and work it more into the paper, but you're going to see that that underlying pattern of where you put the strokes is going to remain. This is where the difference to the dust comes in. As you can see, the value is much lighter, but the distribution is much more even. It takes a number of layers to build up depth and can be used alongside the Conte to deepen your surface. Getting to know your erasers can give you better information as to how they each react to the process of lifting. The sharper, more hard-edged ones are good for line-based strokes or measurement points, and the gray one right here is for the faint removals that lend to more shadowy places or midtones where the light is more gradational. You can pull it apart and use it in lots of different scenarios and sizes depending on what your needs really are. The process of subtractive drawing isn't the same idea as the white Conte, except the image is built upon the removal of the charcoal and not the addition of the lighter tones. But inherently this embodies the same visual thinking as using the highlights, positive and negative space, to guide your reasoning and your choices. You can see the shift of the two eraser results here, where I choose to go in with the sharper eraser edge to pull out some of the reflected light of that leaf against the softly faded one in the back. Once you establish the basis of your drawing, it really just works like any other work you'd be doing in an additive way. This can give practice to methods of abstraction as well, as it gets you to identify basically the essentials of form and can help in finding how to reduce your focus to key points in whatever you're drawing through exaggeration and lost and found edges. We've arrived at the final project, and I just wanted to mention that all these ideas and techniques are absolutely applicable to digital work as well. So for the final demo, I decided to work in Procreate, as Procreate is my main digital art desk, but all sorts of programs can do the same sorts of things. So whatever you're set up with, if you work digitally, that's absolutely fine. Procreate has its own section of charcoal brushes that are built into it that you can customize, but I also created a few out of the sketches that I did for this lesson that I'll include in the resources if you want to try them out. So I worked this drawing with a 40-minute timer, and that's basically to compare the developments that are achievable when given certain blocks of time to work within. Your 10-minute exercises are going to look drastically different than to a piece you spent 4 times as much time upon. And how you approach each step of your drawing is totally up to you and your style and how you work. A lot was gone over and introduced in this class, and I'd encourage whatever made sense to you or feels more natural is where to start from. Long-form drawings are where you can really dive deep and take your time and work to find a lot of interesting characteristics that may have been missed in the 10-minute exercises. So because I had this time, I paid a lot more attention to the background, giving the plant an environment to exist within. I also jump around a lot while I'm working, and I never just finish one aspect and move on to the next. As I'm working, I still think like it's paper, and I use the eraser and smudge tools as if I would be drawing on paper. The delete button in digital work is really handy, but I also try to select my brushes and choose my mark making with the same thoughtfulness I would if I were working on paper. And in preparatory drawings like this, I still only use one layer, so I don't have a bunch on the go right now, just to give myself less of a safety net of that eraser, which keeps me alert to my choices as I'm working. If I were to do more experimental tactics though, I'd begin to start layering, just as I would do tests on scraps of paper before committing to whatever technique I'm trying that could change the work entirely or ruin it if it were on paper.